He asked for a glass of water. She looked right through him. The other passengers noticed, but no one said a word. What she didn't know was the man in 21C wasn't just another quiet face in coach, and by the time the plane landed, her career would never take off again. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss the next one. Douglas Red sat quietly in seat 21C, close to the aisle, wearing a pressed gray suit and a soft expression that didn't ask for attention. His dark brown leather shoes were polished, his silver watch sat neat on his wrist, and his short salt and pepper hair was combed clean. He didn't lean back or stretch his legs like some of the others. He just sat there, calm, hands resting on his knees, waiting for takeoff. When the flight attendant passed by to check seatbelts, he nodded politely and gave her a gentle smile. She didn't return it. Her name tag read Kendra, and she kept her eyes low, barely stopping near his row. About 20 minutes into the flight, the drink cart rolled down the aisle. Kendra was laughing at something a young man in row 19 had said. She handed him a can of soda and winked. When she reached Douglas's row, she looked past him. The man in the window seat beside him was already sipping a water bottle. Douglas leaned forward slightly and said, "Excuse me, could I have a glass of water when you get a chance?" Kendra didn't write anything down or give a nod. She just kept moving. He didn't ask again. He waited. The cart rolled away. She didn't come back. A few rows ahead, she handed a full bottle of water to a teenager in a baseball cap. The boy smiled. She smiled wider. Douglas watched without a word. A few people glanced his way but quickly looked down. He straightened his back and pressed the call button. Not urgently. Just once. Quiet. Kendra returned after a moment, her lips tight. "Yes," she said flatly. "I asked earlier, if there's water, I'd appreciate a small glass." Kendra glanced at the tray in her hands. "Water's limited right now," she said, her voice sharp at the edges. "It's being served in first class. We'll see what we have left later." Then she walked away. Douglas didn't blink, didn't flinch. He folded his hands again. He looked out the window. Outside, clouds stretched low across the wing. The man beside him looked away, uncomfortable. A younger woman across the aisle frowned but said nothing. The air felt colder than it had a few moments earlier. No one raised their voice. No one made a scene. But something small and heavy had shifted inside that narrow row, and though no one knew it yet, nothing about this flight would stay ordinary for long. The flight continued in quiet hums and soft chimes, but for Douglas Red, the silence meant something different now. It wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that settled around a man who had been looked past too many times. He didn't tap his foot or sigh. He simply reached into the side pocket of his jacket, pulled out a black notepad, and opened to a blank page. His handwriting was neat, small. At the top, he wrote the flight number, a W208. Kendra moved through the aisle again, this time offering small snack bags. She stopped at row 20 and spoke kindly to an elderly couple, asking about their connecting flight. Douglas sat straight, eyes forward. When she reached his row, she leaned over to offer the snacks to the man next to him, then turned without saying anything to Douglas. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't ask again. From row 24, a woman stood and gently walked up the aisle. She was in her early 30s, wearing a navy blue sweater and black glasses. Her name was Jordan Lynn. She paused beside Douglas's seat and placed a folded napkin in his lap without speaking. He nodded once. She nodded back and returned to her seat. Inside the napkin was a phone number, handwritten, a simple signal. She worked for him, but not as staff on this flight. She was his senior executive assistant. No one knew. Douglas tucked the note inside his jacket pocket. He glanced sideways at the tray Kendra had pushed past earlier. It held 3 untouched water bottles. Another man across the aisle had watched it all happen. He leaned toward Douglas and whispered, "You want my water, sir? I haven't touched it." Douglas smiled faintly. "Thank you, but I'm all right." The man nodded. then turned away, unsure whether to say more. Douglas went back to his notepad. Below the flight number, he added a name, Kendra Simmons. Next to it, skipped twice, denied water, offered to others. He capped his pen and leaned back. His face showed no anger, just thought. He had been here before, not in seat 21C, but in situations just like it. Places where people decided with a look or a shrug who mattered and who didn't. He had built a life quietly proving those people wrong. And today would be no different. The seatbelt light blinked on again as the plane dipped slightly into a patch of mild turbulence. A few overhead bins rattled. Kendra moved back to her jump seat, her face still composed, her eyes scanning the cabin but never once stopping on Douglas Red. She had looked past him earlier, not just once, but as if he weren't there at all. That kind of disregard didn't come from being busy. It came from a decision, a quiet one. Douglas closed his eyes for a moment and let the seat cushion press into his back. He wasn't tired. He was thinking. He remembered another time, years ago, when he had been in a room full of venture capitalists, 12 white men in tailored suits. He had been told to wait in the hallway while their assistant set up. One of the partners walked in and casually handed Douglas his coat, assuming he worked there. Douglas held it for a moment, said nothing, then walked to the front of the room and connected his laptop to the projector. That day he secured a $30 million investment without ever mentioning the coat. But he never forgot it. His phone buzzed lightly in his jacket pocket. He slid it out and tilted it toward his lap. A message from Jordan Lynn read, "Confirmed crew manifest. Simmons has 2 prior warnings, low service scores, passenger complaints for selective attitude. Not fired, just moved routes." He breathed in through his nose. Not a deep breath, just enough to stay steady. In row 20, a baby started crying softly. Kendra got up and moved quickly, her steps light and eager. She handed the young mother an extra blanket and offered her a ginger ale. The smile she gave the woman was warm, her voice soft. Douglas watched as she reached out to gently touch the baby's toes. Kindness wasn't missing from her. It was just reserved. Only for certain rows, certain faces. Behind Douglas, a group of tech guys were laughing over some podcast they'd all listened to. One of them said something about startups and billionaires being mostly college dropouts with rich parents. The irony almost made Douglas laugh, but he didn't. His company hadn't started in a dorm room. It started in a converted laundromat in Shreveport. No help, no safety net, just grit and an idea that refused to be ignored. Jordan stood again and headed toward the back of the plane. As she passed Douglas's row, she leaned down slightly, like she was adjusting her bag. "Sir," she whispered under her breath, "I just received the full crew rotation file. She's been flagged before." Douglas didn't answer. He only nodded once. That was all she needed. She kept walking. Across the aisle, the same man who had offered his water earlier, his name tag said Wayne Holt, was still watching the flight attendant carefully. His jaw was tight now. He didn't speak this time. He just shook his head and looked at Douglas with a look of quiet apology. Douglas appreciated it, but he didn't need it. He had spent a lifetime in rooms where people made assumptions before he opened his mouth. He had learned the power of waiting, of acting when others were least expecting it. Right now, he wasn't humiliated. He wasn't angry. He was gathering, watching, marking every move. Because sometimes the sharpest response wasn't loud. It was patient. And this time, it would be seen. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight continued westward, casting a soft amber glow along the ceiling. The air smelled faintly of plastic packaging and recycled cool air. But Douglas Red's mind wasn't on the plane anymore. It drifted to a memory he didn't pull out often, a moment from nearly 20 years ago, when he had first realized how invisible a man could be, even when dressed in his best. He had walked into the reception area of a conference in Dallas, holding a visitor badge that had his name printed in bold, Douglas H. Red, founder, Horizon Cap Ventures. He remembered the woman at the front desk barely looking up when he approached. She handed him a parking validation slip, and motioned toward the waiting area. 5 minutes later, a younger white man in jeans walked in behind him, holding nothing. The same woman stood, greeted him warmly, and asked if he needed directions to the VIP suite. Douglas had smiled then, too. The same kind of smile he wore now on this plane. One that didn't stretch too far. One that covered the slow sting in his chest. The world had taught him early on. Sometimes, it wasn't raised voices or slammed doors that made you feel small. Sometimes it was silence, shrugs, skipped names, cold smiles. Back on the flight, Kendra passed by again. She didn't speak. She stopped at the row ahead, asked the elderly couple if they were warm enough, if they wanted a refill. Douglas looked up at her face. There was a softness in her features now, the kind of warmth people saved for grandparents and quiet passengers they assumed wouldn't complain. She never once glanced at him. Douglas folded his hands together on his lap. The cuff of his suit shifted slightly, revealing a gold wristwatch. Not flashy, classic, understated. The kind of timepiece that most wouldn't recognize unless they knew what it meant. It had been a gift from the board of his company after the airline's third expansion. He had flown coach the entire first year of building Altitude West, even when they could barely pay their vendors. It wasn't about comfort back then. It was about principles. Still was. The man beside him, a younger guy in his 40s with a weathered leather jacket and a scruffy beard, finally spoke up. "Sir, I gotta ask. That woman..." He leaned slightly toward Douglas, careful not to draw too much attention. "She's been skipping your row this whole time. You good?" Douglas turned to him. His voice was calm and low. "I'm fine. Thank you." The man didn't push, but he did glance up the aisle again. "Just doesn't sit right." "I've seen worse," Douglas added softly, almost to himself. It wasn't just about the water now. He didn't need it. He hadn't been thirsty in 20 minutes. But he also wasn't about to ask a third time. That moment had passed. What stayed with him now wasn't dehydration. It was the weight of the decision she had made. The look she had chosen not to give. The pause she hadn't taken to ask if he needed anything. Behind the silence, Douglas felt something stir. Not quite anger, but something deeper. A tiredness. A steady ache that had collected over years of being passed over, misjudged, and quietly dismissed in rooms where he had every right to belong. He thought of his son, now in his 30s, who once asked, "How do you stay calm when they treat you like you're not even in the room?" And he had answered with something simple. "Because I never forget, I own the room." He didn't wear his status. He never had to. But that didn't mean it didn't weigh on him. It did. Not because he needed to be seen, but because it mattered that people like him weren't made invisible, especially when they'd earned their place. The seatbelt light clicked off again. Kendra stood from her jump seat and began her final service check. She passed by Douglas once more. Still no words, no glance. Just a tight-lipped smile aimed vaguely forward like he wasn't even there. Douglas stared at the seat back in front of him. His knuckles rested lightly on the armrest, his fingertips still. Inside, though, his thoughts weren't. They moved fast and precise. He tapped his phone screen, typed a short note, and saved it to his encrypted folder. One sentence. "Initiate Level 2 crew review. Flight AW208. Then he closed the phone and rested it face down on the tray table. He folded his hands again, calmly. To anyone looking at him, he appeared untouched by what had happened. But inside, something had shifted. Something final. And before this flight landed, someone else was going to feel it. As the plane flew steady over the dark stretch of the American Southwest, the world outside the windows was silent. Just a blanket of deep blue with scattered pinholes of light from small towns below. Inside, the cabin was hushed too. A few passengers were nodding off. Some watched movies with earbuds in. Others scrolled through their phones with tired eyes. But Douglas Red wasn't tired. Not yet. He sat still, upright, legs crossed at the ankle, hands calm on his lap. To anyone walking past, he looked like a man thinking about nothing. But his mind was moving sharply, methodically, like a file being opened, sorted, and stored with exact detail. Every moment from the past hour, every skipped glance, every small choice Kendra Simmons had made was now filed away. Not because he wanted to punish her, but because something about it felt too familiar, and he was done letting it slide. He had seen this behavior 1,000 times before. Quiet, controlled, socially polite discrimination. Not the kind that people talked about in training seminars. The kind that went unnoticed by most because it was never loud, never written down. Just small differences in how people were treated. Who got offered coffee without asking? Who got asked their name? Who got ignored? Kendra hadn't called him by name once. Douglas had pre-checked his boarding pass. His name was listed as Douglas H. Red, AW Diamond Status Owner Tier. A tag that only 50 people in the world held. Not because it was for sale, but because he had built the airline from scratch. And still, on this flight, none of it mattered. He had been made into just another quiet old man and coach, just another face to brush past. That wasn't the problem. The problem was how easily it happened. Across the aisle, Wayne Holt leaned forward again, a little less careful this time. "Sorry if I'm stepping out of line, but I've been watching this whole time. The flight attendant, she's treating you different." Douglas turned toward him, his eyes steady. "Different how?" Wayne hesitated, then shrugged. "Like you're invisible." Douglas didn't respond right away. His eyes dropped to the carpet under the seat, then slowly lifted again. "That's not new." Wayne frowned. "Still wrong." A long pause passed between them. Then Douglas nodded. "Yes. Still wrong." There was a tone to his voice that was hard to describe. It wasn't sharp, but it held weight. Like someone who had been forced to accept things for a long time, but never truly forgot them. Wayne shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I don't get it, man. You're dressed sharp. You carry yourself like you've got presence. She skips you like you don't even exist." Douglas offered a faint smile. "Some people are trained to only see a certain kind of presence." Wayne glanced down, quiet. The words sat heavy between them. Up front, Kendra's laughter echoed faintly again as she chatted with a young man in business class who had walked to the front galley. Her voice was soft, sweet. She handed him a cookie from the premium tray. She reached for the tongs, gently placed a slice of lemon in his tea. Polished, attentive, kind. Douglas watched from a distance, not with bitterness but with clarity. It wasn't that she couldn't be warm. It was that she chose when to be, and who to be it with. And today, she had made her choices clear. From behind him, Jordan Lynn stood and slowly walked forward. She stopped briefly at Douglas's row and placed a small folded paper cup next to him on the tray table. Inside, nothing, just a gesture. Then she whispered, without looking at him, "Audit file opened. Pilot aware, operations on standby." Then she kept walking. Douglas didn't touch the cup. He didn't need to. What mattered had already begun. The system was in motion. There was no anger in him, but there was a deep, buried ache. He remembered what it felt like to sit at boardroom tables and be asked if he was with the catering team before he opened his pitch deck. He remembered what it felt like to stand next to competitors with half the experience, twice the visibility, and still be questioned. And even now, after all these years, after everything he had built, it hadn't stopped. But this time, it wouldn't be ignored. He wasn't going to yell. He didn't need to. That was the power of knowing exactly who you are and letting the world find out on its own terms. Douglas reached for the phone in his inner pocket again. He tapped once. A screen opened showing a secure connection. Command Protocol 2.3. Activated internal staff review. Flight AW208. Initiated by Red DH. Then he closed the phone, folded his arms lightly, and waited. There was still time left in the flight, and before it landed, something else would take off. The cabin lights dimmed further as the flight crew prepared for evening rest mode. A soft announcement came through the speakers, reminding passengers to stay seated and keep their seatbelts fastened. Most of the cabin had settled into a lull. The man beside Douglas had dozed off, arms folded, chin dropping now and then onto his chest. A baby a few rows back whimpered but didn't cry. The gentle drone of the engines was the only steady sound. Douglas Red stared out the window, though there was nothing to see. Just darkness and faint glimmers of stars. His reflection sat faint in the glass. Eyes tired, mouth set in a quiet line. He looked older than he felt tonight, though age didn't usually bother him. He had earned every line on his face, every gray hair in his beard. But the weight he felt now wasn't from years. It was from something else, something older, something heavier. It was the kind of weight that comes from pretending things don't sting just to get through the day. He thought of his mother. Her hands were always rough from cleaning homes, but she'd stroke his hair with such gentleness that it made him feel like royalty. She used to say, "There's no shame in being quiet, Dougie. Just don't let quiet turn into silence." He had followed that advice his whole life. He let others speak first. He let disrespect pass, but only until it touched something that shouldn't be touched. Today, that something was his dignity. Not because of the water, not even because of Kendra's tone. It was because she hadn't even seen him. She had looked straight through him, over him, and around him, as if the seat he occupied didn't belong to anyone worth noticing. And it wasn't the first time. That realization stuck in his chest like a stone. He shifted slightly, resting one hand over his stomach, fingers tapping gently on his suit jacket. A small rhythmic motion, just enough to keep him steady. He knew better than to act out on a plane. This wasn't about drama. He wasn't going to speak to a supervisor or demand attention. That wasn't his way. His way was quiet, measured, precise, and it had always worked. Up ahead, Kendra was back near the galley, leaning against the wall, scrolling through her phone. Her posture relaxed, not a care in the world. Another flight, another set of passengers. Nothing unusual in her mind. She didn't know yet that the man in seat 21C had set something in motion. She didn't know that her behavior had already been flagged, not just by someone in the cabin, but by someone who had the power to make decisions that reached boardrooms, policy meetings, training centers, and hiring protocols. She didn't know that this time, the person she brushed aside wouldn't disappear. Douglas's phone buzzed gently again in his pocket. He retrieved it and turned the screen just enough to read. Full crew data verified. Simmons linked to 2 past internal reviews. Both dismissed without formal action. Review escalation approved. He read the message 3 times, slowly. 2 complaints. Dismissed. He didn't wonder why, he already knew why. Because she smiled at the right people. Because her words weren't rude, just dismissive. Because when someone like him spoke up, the response was always the same. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. No one ever wrote down the tone of voice, or the time delay, or the way the server's eyes lit up for one passenger but dulled when speaking to another. But he had built a company around watching what others missed, and now it was time for someone else to watch her, closely. He closed the phone again, this time slipping it into the inside lining of his jacket. He placed both hands on the tray table, slowly curling and uncurling his fingers. He felt steady, but under that steady breath, something deeper swirled, an ache that came from a long road walked in hard shoes. He had carried this weight alone for years, often too proud to name it out loud. But tonight something was different. Maybe it was the silence of the cabin. Maybe it was the way Kendra had smiled at every other man but hadn't once looked him in the eye. Maybe it was just that he had finally had enough. He looked out the window again. Nothing had changed outside. Still dark, still sky. But inside him something had shifted. It wasn't rage. It wasn't revenge. It was resolve. He would not speak. He would not explain. He would let the system speak instead. And this time it would have no choice but to listen. The plane began its slow descent into San Diego. The seatbelt signs chimed on again, followed by the captain's calm voice announcing clear skies and a smooth landing expected in 20 minutes. Passengers stirred from their rest. Screens flickered off. Blankets were folded. The woman in 22D behind Douglas tapped her child awake with soft fingers. Quiet activity rippled through the rows like the low tide pulling back before a wave. Douglas Red remained still. He had not eaten. He had not asked again for water. He had not moved from his upright posture for the last 2 hours. But he had watched. Not just Kendra. Not just the cabin crew. He had watched the way people around him responded. The awkward glances, the stolen looks, the silence that followed the discomfort they all tried to ignore. No one had said it aloud, but the energy had changed. There was something about being mistreated in public that hit differently, not because of the act itself, but because everyone saw it and chose not to respond. That part always cut deeper. The moment when people noticed, but looked away. Not out of malice, but out of convenience, because stepping in would cost them comfort. Douglas had grown used to that cost. He had paid it enough times to know its shape. He thought about his granddaughter. She was 12. Smart, sharp-eyed, asked too many questions. A month ago she had asked him, "Pop, how do you know when someone's being fake nice?" He had paused before answering, then said, "When their smile disappears the second they look away." Kendra's smile had never once reached his brow, and that wasn't a mistake. Up ahead, she was now checking tray tables, helping a man 2 rows in front of Douglas with his overhead bag. Her voice was light, conversational. "I hope you had a nice flight, Mr. Ellery." She even remembered his name. Mr. Ellery nodded, thanked her, called her excellent. Douglas watched the exchange with quiet detachment. It didn't upset him. It clarified everything. She had remembered his name. She had seen it on her manifest. She had read it on his ticket. She had simply decided it didn't need to be used, a kind of quiet erasure. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a worn leather folder. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a paperback book, but inside it were folded documents he always kept with him, not because he needed them, but because sometimes people needed to see them. He opened the flap and slid out a single laminated card. Altitude West Executive Board Credential, Owner Level, Douglas H. Red. He didn't show it to anyone. He just held it for a second, looking at his name printed in clear block letters. It wasn't about pride. It was about grounding, a reminder, in his own hands, of who he was, of what he had built. He had flown this route dozens of times. He had signed every final approval for the new cabin layouts. He had personally overseen the hiring of the airline's first director of diversity and inclusion. And still, tonight, he had been treated like nothing. But not for long. He slid the credential back into its folder, tucked it away, and straightened his tie. His mind was calm, but alert. Not with nerves, not with anger, but with clarity. The kind of clarity that sharpened when truth no longer had to be spoken to be understood. Jordan Lynn stood quietly in the aisle a few rows behind. She met Douglas's eyes just for a second, then lowered her gaze. No signal needed. Everything was already in motion. The phone in his pocket buzzed again. He didn't look right away. Instead, he turned his head slowly toward the window, though nothing could be seen but the faint lights of the city approaching beneath them. His reflection looked back, older, quiet, but unchanged. A man who had been denied water in his own house. A man who had been made invisible in the airline he built. But also, a man who would never need to raise his voice to be heard. The buzz came again. He finally pulled out the phone and glanced down. Message received. Final escalation triggered. Crew ID logged. Legal observers notified. Terminal coordination confirmed. He slid the phone back into his jacket. Then he reached forward and calmly buckled his seatbelt as the plane began its final descent. Outside the windows, San Diego grew brighter. Inside, seat 21C, the light was already on. The wheels of flight AW208 touched the runway with a soft screech, the brakes humming as the aircraft slowed. A ripple of motion passed through the cabin, passengers leaning forward, seatbacks returning to upright, fingers stretching toward overhead compartments, before the chime even gave permission. Douglas Red stayed seated, still, calm. one hand on the armrest, the other resting gently on his thigh. His seatbelt remained fastened. He didn't rush. He never did. He stared at the back of seat 20C. Faint scratches in the plastic, a frayed edge near the tray hinge. None of it mattered, but it held his attention. It gave him a surface to focus on while his thoughts arranged themselves behind his eyes. All this, because of a glass of water? That wasn't it, not even close. He had been denied more important things in life: office space, loans, investor meetings, second interviews, and every time it happened, it had been wrapped in civility. No one had ever yelled at him. No one had ever called him a slur or slammed a door in his face. That would have made it too easy to name. What they did was simpler. They paused before shaking his hand. They addressed someone else first. They looked past him in rooms he paid to enter. They gave him the wrong seat when they thought no one would notice, just like Kendra Simmons did tonight. Not once, but every chance she had. And now, she was moving up the aisle again, her smile intact, her eyes bright as she helped passengers with their carry-ons. She stood close to the white couple in 18A and B, guiding the man's suitcase down gently and placing it in his hands with care. She told them, "Hope to see you again with Altitude West. You've been wonderful." Douglas caught that line and held it for a second. "You've been wonderful." He thought about how that phrase rolled so easily from her lips to some, and how, to others, silence was all they got. The pilot's voice came over the speaker, welcoming everyone to San Diego. The usual "thank you for flying" message, rehearsed and warm. Douglas listened, not for the words, but for the tone. He could tell when people meant things. He had spent most of his career decoding tone more than contracts. His phone buzzed once. Then again. He ignored it. He took a breath instead. Long, quiet. His eyes moved toward the aisle where passengers now began standing. Jordan remained seated, 2 rows behind. She looked at him once, then reached into her handbag and pulled out a black ID badge with the silver Altitude West logo. She clipped it quietly to her blouse. Kendra passed by again, nodding at those waiting to disembark. She reached Douglas's row and looked down at him. Not directly. Her glance skimmed past him to the passenger beside him, who had already stood and was gathering his coat. Then she said something, flat, mechanical. "Thank you for flying with us." Douglas looked up slowly, meeting her eyes fully for the first time. There was a pause, not a dramatic one. Just long enough for her to realize something in his gaze was different. He didn't blink. He didn't smile. He just said, "You're welcome." Then he turned away from her without looking back. That small act, those 2 words, were heavier than they sounded. Not because of their meaning, but because of their certainty. It was the first time she truly looked at him. Her face twitched, barely noticeable. But Douglas saw it. The flicker of doubt. The moment where her own script faltered. She stepped away. The line of passengers began to move. Bags tugged from compartments, shoes shuffled into the aisle. Wayne Holt, from across the aisle, nodded toward Douglas as he passed. His face said what his words hadn't dared. "I saw it. All of it." Douglas waited until most had gone. Jordan stood behind him, quiet, calm, alert. The last few passengers filtered out. Then at the front of the cabin, 2 figures in dark suits appeared at the entry door. One, a tall man with a thick binder in hand and a gold Altitude West pin on his lapel. The other, a woman with square glasses and a tight ponytail, holding a slim tablet and a lanyard marked "Legal Affairs, Internal Review." Kendra's smile faded as her posture stiffened. She looked between them, then to the aisle, as if she could step out quickly. But she didn't move. Douglas stood, slowly, with care. He adjusted the hem of his jacket, straightened his back, and stepped forward. Kendra took a half step back. The man in the suit extended a hand toward Douglas. "Mr. Red, we're ready when you are, sir." Kendra's eyes widened slightly. Her mouth parted, just enough for a question to form, but it never came out. Douglas didn't look at her again. He walked off the plane without a word, his polished shoes silent against the carpet. Behind him, The silence was deafening. The tunnel leading from the aircraft to the terminal felt colder than usual. Maybe because of the contrast from the warm, recycled cabin air, or maybe because of the sudden shift in atmosphere. Douglas Red walked slowly, not out of stiffness but out of intention. Every step was measured. His hands remained relaxed at his sides, his breathing steady, but there was weight behind each movement. Not from exhaustion, from clarity. Behind him, Kendra Simmons exited the aircraft seconds later, her posture noticeably stiffer. She smiled when she saw a ground crew member but faltered when her eyes landed on the two waiting staff members in dark suits near the gate, one with a clipboard, the other tapping a screen. Jordan Lynn followed just a few paces behind Douglas. She said nothing. She didn't have to. Her presence was deliberate, quiet, and firm. She walked like someone trained to disappear in crowds but stand tall when it counted. Douglas noticed how the usual buzz of passengers was still present. Families gathering bags, tired flyers checking their phones. But in his immediate circle, there was stillness. An invisible bubble had formed around him. People didn't know who he was yet, but they sensed something in the air. Something important had just walked off that plane. At the end of the tunnel, a man in a charcoal gray blazer stepped forward. He had a discreet earpiece and a folder tucked under one arm. "Mr. Red," he said, his tone respectful. "I'm Malcolm Weaver, Deputy Director of Ground Operations, Altitude West San Diego." Douglas gave a small nod. "Mr. Weaver." Weaver cleared his throat, looked behind him toward the jet bridge, then back at Douglas. "We received your confirmation earlier. Legal team is in the briefing room. Staff members are being held from shift rotation." Douglas paused. "And Ms. Simmons?" "Escorted by HR separate room." He nodded again. "Good." Jordan stepped slightly to the side, pulling out her tablet, already loading documents. Her fingers moved swiftly, and without looking up, she said, 3 incidents logged. 2 dismissed previously. This one won't be." Weaver shifted awkwardly. "Understood." Douglas turned slightly toward the concourse, eyes skimming the rows of windows glowing with nightlight. The city sparkled in the distance, calm, unaware. But here, in this small slice of the airport, something larger was unfolding. Not loud, not public, but no less real. And that's what made it matter more. He thought again about his granddaughter, how excited she had been to tell her class that her grandfather owns airplanes. He had smiled when she said it, corrected her gently. "I don't own airplanes, sweet pea. I own an airline." She had blinked, then nodded like she understood. Maybe she didn't yet, but she would. And when she grew into a world that still asked her to shrink herself, he hoped she'd remember moments like this, where quiet men didn't bow, even when it would have been easier. He followed Weaver through a secured glass door marked "Authorized Personnel Only," while Jordan continued typing. They passed through a back corridor of the terminal. The walls were plain white, the lighting clean and bright. No advertisements, no music, just silence and movement. Staff with ID tags parted to let them pass. Some looked surprised. Others recognized the name on Jordan's screen. Douglas's phone vibrated again. He ignored it. They reached a conference room with frosted glass walls. Inside sat 2 women and 1 man, all in business attire, eyes focused on a stack of printed reports. One of them stood as Douglas entered. Her badge read Trina DeLoach, Ethics and Compliance Lead. "Mr. Red," she said, extending her hand, "thank you for coming directly. We're ready for your statement and formal review initiation. Do you wish to observe the interview?" Douglas sat down slowly in the chair at the head of the table. Jordan took the seat beside him. He didn't rush to respond. Instead, he folded his hands and looked up. His voice was low and even. "No need. I'm not here for a show." Trina nodded once. "Understood." He leaned back slightly. "I'm here because your system allowed someone like her to keep flying. Not because of one bad day, but because no one ever stayed long enough to pay attention." Weaver cleared his throat. "We've taken her off active duty. Full suspension pending the review outcome." Douglas didn't respond right away. He stared at the folder in front of him. A small label read AW208, Service Discrepancy Report. He tapped a finger lightly on the edge of the paper. Then he looked up again. "Do you know how long it takes to build trust in a brand?" he asked, not to anyone in particular. The room remained silent. "Years," he answered for them. "Decades, sometimes. But you can lose it in a moment, in a single ignored voice, in a skipped seat." His words hung heavy in the air. Jordan broke the silence, her tone steady. "We have full AI logs, service patterns, bias triggers flagged across 3 flights. The system caught it, but no action was taken." Trina's jaw tightened. "That ends now." Douglas looked at her, finally a flicker of approval in his eyes. "Make sure it does," he said, "because the next time someone in 21st century doesn't get water, it won't be me." He stood. The chair didn't scrape. His movements were too deliberate for that. He picked up his folder, nodded to Jordan, and walked to the door. Before exiting, he paused, hand on the handle. Then, without turning around, he said, "Your uniforms say Altitude West. Let's make sure your culture flies just as high." And with that, he left the room. The silence he left behind wasn't empty. It was echoing. Outside the conference room, the airport terminal buzzed with life. Passengers moved through security lines. Families reunited at baggage claim. Taxi engines hummed in a long, slow crawl outside the glass doors. It was just another night in San Diego. But inside Douglas read, the air felt different. He walked slowly through the private terminal hallway. Jordan one step behind, silent. Her eyes stayed focused, but Douglas could feel the weight in her stride too. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The work had been done. The audit triggered. The reports filed. The culture shift set in motion, but the ache didn't leave him. Not yet. He passed a security guard standing near the escalators. The young man, no older than 25, nodded slightly and gave a polite, "Evening, sir." Douglas returned the nod with a gentle smile. Politeness was not rare, but meaning behind it. That was. He paused near a row of windows that looked out onto the runway. The night stretched long beyond the tarmac, speckled with airport lights that blinked in slow, steady rhythms. Planes moved in silence like ghosts in the dark. Douglas stepped closer to the glass and rested one hand on the metal edge of the frame. His reflection stared back. Older, yes. Wiser, certainly. But tonight, behind his eyes, there was something else, something older than tired. A still, lingering ache that no boardroom power or legal win could erase, because deep down it still hurt. Not the water, not even Kendra's tone. What hurt, what always hurt, was knowing that even now, after decades of building, earning, surviving, someone could still look at him and not see him. And worse, think nothing of it. He breathed in deeply through his nose, slow and careful, holding the breath at the top of his chest before letting it out quietly. That was how he steadied himself. Always had. Even in boardrooms where he was the only one in a dark suit. Even in meetings where his name was on the building. But the receptionist asked who he was there to see. He hadn't built Altitude West to prove anything. He had built it because he refused to let people like him keep getting pushed to the back. Still, some days the pushing didn't stop. Jordan stepped beside him now, her voice soft, almost uncertain. "We can leave through the side garage if you'd rather not walk through the lobby." He nodded, still facing the window. "Give me a minute." She waited. Quiet. He closed his eyes. Just for a few seconds, he thought about his father, a man who had driven buses in Louisiana for 37 years. A man who once told him, "They don't gotta know who you are. You gotta know who you are." He used to come home with grease on his hands and never once complained. But Douglas remembered watching him eat dinner in silence some nights, long after the family had gone to bed, just staring at the wall. Back then, he didn't understand that kind of silence. Now he did. It was the silence that comes after you swallow every slight, every look, every lie told with a smile. And tonight, that silence sat heavy on Douglas's chest. Jordan gently touched his elbow, her voice more firm now. They're debriefing the flight crew in separate rooms. HR flagged Kendra's personnel file. It's not going to get buried this time. He gave her a glance. That's not why I'm standing here. She didn't ask why. She just stayed close. He turned back toward the reflection. His fingers tapped the edge of the window twice like a metronome. I don't want this to be about me, he said finally, voice barely above a whisper. I want it to be about what happens next. Who gets to feel like they belong? Who doesn't have to prove their worth for a bottle of water? Jordan lowered her eyes. She understood. They stood in silence for a moment longer before Douglas straightened his jacket and began walking toward the private exit. As they passed through a back corridor lined with maintenance doors and quiet walls, a familiar ringtone buzzed in his pocket. He reached for the phone but didn't check it right away. Instead, he stopped at the garage entrance, the wind outside now pressing gently against the glass. Then he looked at the screen. It was a message from Altitude West's CEO. Confirmed. Kendra Simmons suspended pending full investigation. We are assembling a diversity oversight committee. Your name is at the top. We'd be honored. Please advise. Douglas read it slowly, twice. Then he closed the message. No reply. Not yet. He stepped outside, the night air hitting his face with a crispness that pulled him fully into the present. Jordan unlocked the car with a soft beep. The back door opened automatically, but Douglas didn't step in right away. He stood there facing the wide runway, and for a long moment, he just watched the sky, planes lifting and landing, lights flickering across the edge of the horizon, and somewhere in that quiet movement, he felt something ease in his chest. Not forgiveness, but maybe relief. Because this time, the silence hadn't won, and he wouldn't let it again. The black sedan pulled away from the airport loading zone, its headlights cutting through the still night like steady beams across water. Inside the back seat, Douglas Red sat with one leg crossed, hands resting loosely on his knee. The leather interior was soft and quiet, the kind of quiet that usually calmed him. But not tonight. Not yet. The car moved smoothly down the airport loop, past rows of terminals and slowly blinking lights, and merged onto the freeway heading north toward his downtown apartment. City lights glowed faintly in the distance. They looked peaceful from here, small, manageable. He stared out the window, watching the signs blur by, but his mind wasn't on road markers. It was still circling the same question. Why did this still feel like a loss? He had done everything right. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't caused a scene. He had taken every step with calm, careful control, just like always. And yet, the heaviness in his chest hadn't lifted, not even with the official confirmations, the investigation, the suspension. Because it wasn't about Kendra Simmons anymore. It never really had been. It was about what she represented, and what he was still fighting for, even now, even after all these years. He turned away from the window and looked down at his phone, still held in one hand. The screen was dark now, but he could still feel the weight of that last message. A committee, a formal invitation, his name at the top. Part of him wanted to smile. After all, it was a win, a real one. But another part, the deeper part, felt a little bitter. They only called when the damage was visible, only offered a seat at the table when someone bled for it, only listened after the silence broke through the walls. Douglas leaned back against the leather seat, his head tilting slightly. The car rocked gently over a patch of uneven road. He thought about how many people never got this far, how many were brushed off, told they were overreacting, told it wasn't that deep. He had been told that before too, in different words, behind professional smiles, by people who thought they were being kind. He remembered one such meeting, 15 years ago, before Altitude West was anything but an idea. A bank manager looked across a glass desk and said, "It's a very ambitious concept, Mr. Red. Maybe too ambitious. Maybe not the right fit." The words had been polite, so polished, But the message was sharp underneath: you don't belong in this space. He had smiled then too, the same tight smile he gave Kendra. That smile wasn't for them. It was for himself. A reminder not to forget what was being said beneath the surface. He pulled out his leather folder again and flipped it open, this time revealing the second card beneath his credentials. It was one he hadn't shown in years. A photo ID from Horizon Charter Systems, his first company. Back when he was still in his 40s, still chasing permits, still explaining to investors why charter flights needed to be more equitable. He stared at the ID for a long moment. He looked so young in the photo, too polite, too hopeful. He slid the card back inside, then pressed the folder shut with a quiet snap. "Sir," the driver said softly from the front seat. "Would you like me to stop anywhere before heading home?" Douglas looked up. "Number, thank you." The driver nodded and turned his attention back to the road. A pause filled the space between them. Not awkward, just quiet. Then Douglas spoke again. "Do you fly often?" The driver, caught off guard, chuckled gently. "A bit. My sister lives in Seattle. I go up there when I can." "Ever flown altitude west?" The driver thought for a moment. "Yeah, twice, I think. It was good. Felt a little pricey, but it was smooth." Douglas smiled faintly. "That's fair." Another pause. The driver glanced in the mirror. "You with the airline?" Douglas met the driver's eyes in the reflection. "Something like that." The driver nodded respectfully, unsure what to say. The car pulled off the freeway and wound through the quiet streets of downtown. Buildings stood tall and still, glowing softly in the orange halo of streetlights. A few restaurants still buzzed with late-night diners. Douglas watched them through the window, each one its own little world. He wondered how many people inside those places had stories like his. Stories of being passed over, shrugged at, treated like an afterthought in spaces they had helped build. He wondered how many had stayed quiet, and how many had stayed too quiet for too long. As the car turned the final corner, his building came into view. The lobby lights were still on, casting a soft gold glow across the sidewalk. The driver pulled up to the curb and put the car in park. Douglas didn't move at first. He looked down at his phone one more time. The message from the CEO was still there, unanswered. He tapped the screen once, typed a simple response. "I'll serve on one condition. This doesn't start and end with policy. It ends when no one needs to speak up to be seen." He pressed send. Then slowly, he stepped out of the car and into the night. The door shut softly behind him. He didn't look back. The elevator ride to the 28th floor was quiet, save for the soft hum of machinery and the gentle chime at each level. Douglas Red stood alone inside the mirrored lift, his reflection bouncing back at him from all sides. Tall, composed but weary in a way he hadn't let himself admit earlier. He adjusted his collar, ran one hand over his closely trimmed beard, and exhaled through his nose. Slow, heavy. Not because he was tired, but because the weight of what had just unfolded hadn't settled until now. In public he had stayed sharp, controlled, the still eye of the storm. But now, as the elevator crept past the 23rd floor, and the city lights spread wide beneath him, the armor began to loosen. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened to him. But something about this time, the setting, the silence, the look in Kendra Simmons's eyes when she finally realized who he was, made it different. It wasn't the realization that stung. It was how predictable it had been. He had seen that moment before. In meetings, in lounges, in high-end hotel lobbies. That brief flicker of panic in someone's face when the man they overlooked turned out to be the man in charge. And every time it left him with the same sour taste. Because by the time they knew, they had already shown who they really were. The elevator chimed again. The doors slid open smoothly, revealing a long hallway lined with dim wall sconces and dark hardwood floors. Douglas stepped out, walking past tall plants and framed abstract paintings he had personally chosen when the building first opened. This space had always brought him calm, but tonight, it felt hollow. He reached his front door and paused for a moment before unlocking it. The door clicked and he stepped inside. Warm lights glowed from the hallway sensor. The place smelled faintly of cedar and something citrusy. Jordan must have arranged for the cleaning crew earlier. Everything was spotless. The kitchen island gleamed. A glass decanter sat untouched beside a stack of neatly arranged coasters. He set his keys down with care, opened the coat closet, and slowly removed his jacket. The weight of the day clung to the fabric like damp air. He folded it over the back of the nearest chair and made his way to the living room. The floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the entire downtown skyline, crisp, golden, quiet. Cars flowed in thin lines along the avenues below. Douglas loosened his tie and sat down on the edge of the couch, resting his elbows on his knees. The silence was thick now, not the peaceful kind, the kind that creeps in when your thoughts have nowhere left to hide. He thought back to that first meeting with the Altitude West investors. 10 white men in pressed suits. He had walked in with a briefcase full of plans. Flight routes, customer service reforms, dynamic pricing models, retention strategies for underserved passengers. They had glanced at his slides, nodded politely. One of them leaned back, smirking. "Nice concept, Mr. Red. But we're not sure if luxury travel and social equity really belong in the same sentence." That sentence had haunted him for years, not because it surprised him, but because it didn't. He had smiled back then, too. Calm, quiet. He had left the room, gathered different investors, and built the company from the ground up. A company that now had contracts with 3 international airports and a customer satisfaction rating higher than any domestic competitor. But still, on that flight tonight in seat 21C, he had been made invisible in his own house. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, eyes closed for a long moment. The ache behind his eyes had nothing to do with fatigue. It was history, accumulated, compacted. Moments like tonight made him wonder if anything ever truly changed, or if they just got better at hiding the same old dismissals behind smoother language and practiced smiles. His phone buzzed again. He didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, he stood and walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and held it in his hand. Just held it. A glass of water. That's how it had all started. One small thing. Denied, ignored, dismissed. And yet, it was never small. It never had been, because it wasn't about thirst. It was about being reminded, in the smallest of ways, that even your presence was negotiable. He brought the glass to his lips, took a slow sip and set it down with care. Then finally, he picked up his phone. The screen lit up. This time the message wasn't from the CEO. It was from his son. Saw what happened, read the reports. "You good?" Douglas stared at those 2 words. "You good?" He thought for a long time before replying. "Yeah, but tired of being the only one who has to keep proving it." His son replied instantly. "You shouldn't have to. You've done more than enough, now they know. Keep your seat." Douglas felt a small throb in his chest. Pride and weariness tangled together. He typed one final message back. "I'll keep it, not just for me." Then he set the phone down, walked to the window and stared out at the sky. Somewhere above that blanket of stars, another plane was landing. Someone else was being asked to wait, to explain, to shrink. But maybe now, just maybe, when they pressed the call button, someone would actually come, and not just with a glass of water, but with recognition, and maybe, finally, with respect. Morning sunlight crawled across the floorboards of Douglas Red's apartment like slow-moving silk. It touched the legs of the coffee table, the edge of the rug, and then crept up the arm of the couch where Douglas sat in the same position he had hours ago. Leaning slightly forward, elbows on knees, eyes open, but still. He hadn't slept. Not because he couldn't, because he didn't want to. There were nights like this sometimes. Nights when everything inside him stayed too alert to rest. Nights when the quiet of the world made his own thoughts louder. It wasn't anxiety. He'd long learned how to keep that at bay. It was reflection. Too much of it. He sat in a soft t-shirt now, bare feet resting on the cold wood floor, a wool blanket wrapped loosely around his shoulders. His phone lay beside him, face down. The last few messages from colleagues, executives, and distant acquaintances still unread, people reaching out, people wanting to talk. But Douglas didn't want to talk. He didn't want sympathy or praise or back-patting from corporate leadership, now scrambling to clean the stain that had spread too far to ignore. He didn't need any of it, because he already knew the truth. And the truth didn't sit neatly in email threads or board memos. The truth had been there the moment Kendra Simmons looked over him on that plane, without flinching. The moment her voice changed when speaking to him versus the man across the aisle. The moment the other passengers, even the well-meaning ones, had shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. That was the real system. And it didn't break overnight. It just kept running quietly, until someone pressed the right pressure point. Douglas finally rose from the couch, the blanket falling away from his shoulders. His knees ached a little more these days, but he still moved with purpose. He walked to the kitchen and poured himself another glass of water. This time he drank it slowly, not because he was thirsty, but because it reminded him of the moment it all shifted. That small, clear cup had become a symbol. He had never intended it to be. But that's how change usually started, through symbols people couldn't ignore. He opened the fridge, pulled out a carton of eggs, and paused as he stared at the label. Cage-free, organic, overpriced. He chuckled under his breath. It was strange how the world dressed itself up. Even cruelty came in clean packaging now. As he cracked the eggs into a skillet, the sound of the shells splitting felt too loud in the quiet kitchen. He added salt, a dash of pepper, routine movements, but his hands were steady now, grounded. By the time the eggs were done, the sun had filled most of the room. He sat at the counter with his plate and finally opened his laptop. The screen blinked to life, and waiting in his inbox were 2 flagged messages from the Altitude West board. The first was a forwarded internal memo. All senior flight staff to undergo immediate retraining focused on implicit bias and customer interaction. Disciplinary investigations for AW208 cabin crew to be completed within 10 business days. All actions initiated under guidance of Mr. Red. The second was a formal offer. Position, Cultural Integrity Consultant, Executive Advisory Role, Independent. Compensation, Undisclosed. Scope, Permanent Board Access, Policy Veto Authority. He stared at the offer. It was a powerful seat, a real one. But the irony didn't escape him. They were offering him the front row now, after seeing what happened in row 21. Douglas didn't smile. He closed the email window and opened a different tab, a folder titled Seat 21C, Notes. It was empty for now, but not for long. He began to type, fingers slow at first, then steady. You don't need a title to matter. You don't need a badge to belong. But you do need a system that remembers that. One that doesn't ask the same people to carry the weight of everyone else's learning curve. He stopped, read the sentence back, then nodded slightly. This wasn't going to be just a position. It was going to be a reckoning, slow, careful, and quiet, but firm, irreversible. He would not be the face of change. He was done being a symbol. He would build the room where others didn't have to be. A space where a black woman with a briefcase wouldn't be called Miss when others were called Ma'am. Where a Latino teenager in business class wouldn't be asked 3 times if he was in the wrong seat. Where someone in a wheelchair wouldn't be spoken over but spoken to. Where the smallest kindness wasn't a favor, but the standard. Douglas saved the document and closed the laptop. The apartment was quiet again, but something inside him had shifted. Not just a storm settling, a foundation rising. The day passed slowly, not empty, but thick with thought. Douglas Red moved through his home like a man walking through rooms that held parts of himself. He didn't speak to anyone, didn't check the stock ticker, didn't take the dozen calls that lit up his phone. He wasn't avoiding the world. He was digesting it. He spent part of the afternoon seated at the small writing desk in his study, the same desk he'd used when drafting the earliest frameworks of Altitude West, long before the funding, long before the praise. The desk was walnut, heavy, honest. No clutter on it. Just a worn leather pad, a black pen, and a ceramic mug holding paper clips and a pair of reading glasses he rarely used. He opened a clean notepad and began writing. Not strategy, not business notes, but something else. At the top of the page, he wrote a name. For Harper, his granddaughter. His thoughts flowed slowly, uneven at first, but once they found their rhythm, they became steady, reflective. One day you'll sit in a room where people speak over you, not to you, not because you don't know enough, but because they've already decided you're not supposed to belong. When that happens, don't shrink, don't perform, and don't ever explain why you're still sitting there. Just do the work, better than anyone expected. Let their silence answer itself. He paused and reread the words, then pressed the tip of his pen to the paper again. I didn't change the airline with anger, I changed it with the truth, not loud, not dramatic, just undeniable. You don't need to shout, baby, just move like someone they forgot to expect. He stared at those lines for a long moment, then slowly set the pen down and leaned back in his chair. His fingers moved to the armrest, tapping lightly. His same old rhythm, 2 beats, then a pause. A habit, his way of breathing when his thoughts were heavy. The truth was, something in him had cracked open during that flight. Not broken, but exposed. It had been building for years, maybe decades, not one big moment, but 1,000 little ones. Death by 1,000 shrugs. And the hardest part wasn't the disrespect itself. It was that even with all his success, it still happened. The world didn't care how many companies you built, how many boardrooms you sat in, how many awards you'd been handed. When people looked at him, they still often saw what they expected first. Skin, age, posture. Not the man, not the mind. That was the part that never softened, the part he didn't say out loud, not even to his son. It wasn't bitterness. It was disappointment, quiet and rooted, like a tree that had grown around a rusted nail. He stood from the chair and walked to the bookshelf across the room. On the top shelf sat a photo in a black frame. His father, Carlton Red, sitting on the front bumper of a city bus in his work uniform, laughing with his eyes closed, grease stains on his hands. Douglas smiled faintly, not because it was a happy memory, but because it reminded him of why he still fought. His father hadn't gotten to sit in leather conference rooms or fly business class. But he had taught Douglas how to speak with his walk, how to look people in the eye without fear, how to be silent, but never invisible. That mattered now more than ever. He ran his thumb along the edge of the frame, then walked back into the living room, where the late afternoon sun had stretched long across the floor. Shadows from the window panes cut across the rug in sharp lines. His phone buzzed again, once, then twice. This time, he checked it. A new email. Subject, Internal Flight Debrief. AW208, Confidential Update. He opened it and read the first line. Ms. Simmons's employment with Altitude West has been formally terminated following legal review and passenger reports. A public-facing apology is being drafted for approval. He stared at the screen for a moment, blinking slowly. There it was. The system had moved. The report, the action, the end. He should have felt triumphant, but he didn't. Not really. Because firing one flight attendant didn't fix the altitude problem. The issue had always been deeper than her. She was just one voice in a system that had learned how to whisper prejudice while smiling. Douglas locked the phone and placed it face down on the table. He stood quietly for a long moment, then walked back to the writing desk, picked up the notepad, added one more line. Don't wait for the world to give you permission. Sit in the seat they think isn't yours. Then show them why it always was. He folded the note, slid it into a drawer, and closed it gently. The sun was nearly gone now. Outside, the city had begun to breathe differently. Cars moved slower. The street noise softened. But inside his home, something had shifted again. This time not out of reaction, but preparation. He wasn't done, not by a long shot, because now it was time to build something permanent. Not just a consequence, but a culture. Not just policy, but protection. Not just change, but memory. So that one day someone like Harper could sit in 1A or 34C and be treated the same. Not because of who they are, but because the system had finally learned to see them, without needing a storm to force its eyes open. Night had fully taken the city now. The lights outside Douglas Red's windows flickered in quiet rhythm, office towers glowing like beacons, red brake lights lining the streets below, headlights sweeping across intersections without sound. But inside the apartment it was still. No music, no television. Just the faint ticking of the vintage wall clock in the hall and the low hum of the building's ventilation system. Douglas stood by the window, one hand resting lightly on the glass. The warmth from the apartment met the cold pane, and for a moment he just stood there, letting the silence hold him. He wasn't thinking about the report anymore. Not the termination, not the headlines, not even the board seat. What lingered in him now was something quieter and far older, a kind of grief. Not the loud, broken kind, not the kind that brought tears or collapsed knees, but the kind that stayed behind the ribs. Quiet, constant, like a memory too proud to be forgotten. Grief for how long he had carried this. Grief for how normal it had become to carry it. Grief for the fact that he had never let himself truly call it what it was. Injustice had been so tightly woven into his daily life that he had learned to walk with it like a limp he stopped noticing. But this week something had changed. Not because he'd been disrespected. That wasn't new. And not because people had finally responded. That wasn't the win. What changed was him. For the first time, he hadn't just endured. He had answered with the full weight of who he was. Not loudly, not with rage, but with consequence. And now, standing in the soft light of his apartment, with the whole city below him and the weight of 1,000 small wounds resting quieter than before, Douglas felt something rare stir inside. Not peace, exactly, but rightness. That didn't mean everything had been made whole. The world hadn't turned soft overnight. People like Kendra Simmons weren't new. And systems that held up people like her didn't collapse just because a man in coach filed a report. But something had shifted. And for once, he didn't feel like he had to carry the proof of it alone. He stepped away from the window and returned to the couch, sitting slowly. His knees reminded him again that he wasn't young anymore. But they also reminded him of how far he'd walked. Across boardrooms, across continents, across decades of being seen too late or not at all. And still, he was here. He reached for his phone one last time that night. No alerts, no calls, just one draft message he had written hours earlier, now waiting at the bottom of his screen. It was for Harper. Not something for her to read now, not yet. But someday. He opened the draft and added one final line. Sometimes you won't be given power. Sometimes you'll have to bring it with you, quietly, without warning. And when you do, make sure the door doesn't close behind you. He hit save and set the phone down for good, then leaned back, closed his eyes, and finally, let his body rest. There were no credits to roll, no music to swell, just the quiet victory of a man who had always been expected to shrink, but never forgot how to stand. And now, he wasn't standing alone. If this story touched you, make sure to like the video. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories coming soon.